My trauma began very young, and I'll just interject since I notice it, that one of the side effects of the more recent kind of encounter with trauma has been memory loss and, as a result, speech distortion. And so, despite a few thousand hours of practice, my speech is about 20% distorted. I have a maybe 30% different relationship with speech than I had before. Words sometimes show up missing, or don't sound right. They get kind of formed at the last minute. And so, this, among a number of other things, are some symptoms of trauma and developing PTSD. But beginning the trauma at a young age, some of my first memories were my mother's trauma, the gas oven kind of blowing up in her face, or getting knocked over by the dog that was 3 times my size in tall grass, or being frightened of the bull, in the field across the street in the biodynamic farm that I grew up next to. Falling into the ice, when the ice was too thin. A lot of my earliest memories are and were traumatic. And there's also a lot of shut down sensations and feelings in early childhood. One of the things that I've learned more in retrospect is that we lived and grew up in isolation. And this was my parents' hippie trend towards being more out in nature and, away from the evils of culture, quote unquote. But as a result of that isolation, in a state of infancy, there's more insecurity, there's more dependency on the giants, the few giants, my parents, that were available to protect me. And both of them in various ways played sadistic abandonment games. Whether this was being dragged around in a sack or left out in the forest and, them pretending that they had run off until I burst into tears. There was a concerted effort to evoke and toy around with desperation and fear. As a result of this and other traumatic incidents, I was unable to form a secure attachment with either parent. And as a result of being abandoned repeatedly in traumatized states, shut down more. Now, our culture is designed to protect often the person who's paying the bill, which in this case would be a parent. But it's also designed to protect and insulate the system from data and impulses of change, and instead target the most vulnerable individual, which in this case is the child. And so, for example, under the barrage of this activity, I became hyperactive, right? Because there's nothing to calm down all of the fear and anxiety. So the hyperactivity, the terror led to bedwetting, led to nightmares, led to an anxious, fidgeting type of dynamic. And that doesn't lend itself to concentration in school. Because if you look at a child's worst nightmare, which is being abandoned in a state in which death is inevitable. Now, when your parents have a sadistic streak, the world in projection becomes sadistic, particularly when you're isolated, as we were in the forest. And when the world is scary and you are in a dependent state, when the world wants to hurt you and you are in a dependent state, and there is no safe emotional presence to bond with, it's a condition of complete despair because you need other people, and other people want to hurt you. It's the opposite of what you need. And so the shutting down, the despair, and the hyperactivity, the kind of frenetic movement, are both physiological responses and two kind of ends of the extreme of that continuum, to not be there, to not be present for despair, for fear, for hopelessness, for terror. To either run and try and do something, of course, but there's nothing to be done, so there's just a frenetic fidgeting or a shutting down. Now, these are predictable responses, because to just give up and die, which some children do, or self-mutilate is not optimal. So these are two responses to a sociopathic environment. Now, we do not teach parents how to parent, and we don't attune to children. We just get through it, basically. It's a very clumsy response to an incredibly high art of parenting. And so, first of all of my terror and shutdown, etc., didn't particularly register on anyone's radar until I couldn't learn to read. And then I was sent to a psychologist. And what the psychologist does is they diagnose the symptoms of the patient. Now, this in and of itself is somewhat suspect and sociopathic, because the shutdown and the anxiety were both coping mechanisms to deal with an incompetent culture. An incompetent culture gives two parents the right to have children who don't know how to take care of children. An incompetent culture doesn't notice the abuse in the child. An incompetent culture doesn't stop the parents from abusing the child. And an incompetent culture doesn't look to the environment, to the culture or the parental system, to see what's wrong here. And the incompetent culture does not have a psychologist diagnose the system. The disease is scapegoated onto the infant, which is the least capable of responding, right? For example, if you take an infant and starve it, you can diagnose the infant and say, this infant is suffering from malnutrition. But if you believe that that's somehow the fault of the child, or you just give the child the diagnosis, the real diagnosis is defective parenting, defective agriculture, defective everything else but the child. The child will eat good food if given the chance within a healthy family dynamic. If the dynamic is healthy, the child wants to live. And its biology will guide it towards life. So the psychologist, prescribes things such as you have a learning disorder. But the psychologist does not prescribe things such as you have a parental disorder. You're traumatizing your child. Nobody's looking at it. There's an education disorder. We are a traumatically illiterate culture. There is a cultural disorder. There's too much ignorance in this culture about trauma, about parenting, about traumatic growth. So, psychological diagnoses are a source of shame for the child. Now, it reflects a little bit on the parent, like, what's wrong with you that your child has a diagnosis? There's some of that, which is a sociopathic response, right? Because the parents are an echo of the cultural protocol. They're not an anomaly. Our culture, for thousands of years, has consistently produced a percentage of parents that are sociopathic, addictive, traumatized, and that give all of these diseases to the next generation. And the culture does little or nothing about it, other than to stigmatize the parents and to shame and punish the children raised in that environment, and thus ensure that it gets passed to the next generation. That's defective. That's a cult that's committed to intergenerational disease. The question is, why? And when that is so expensive to the culture, why not spend the pennies on the dollar to prevent and respond, rather than fill the country's prison systems and the country's hospitals with addicts to food and substances, and with people reenacting their trauma, which we've just made illegal. So it's not a very competent system. But the stigma and the diagnosis is directed at the child, who is the least capable of dealing with it at, 8 years old, etc. And so, there was a whole big drama around that occurred in childhood. Now, as a result of this, I developed insecure attachment disorder. And the effect of that in romantic and social life is that I can form very strong, secure, but very close relationships, or no relationship at all. And so it's hard to be in that midground because I never had that midground. The template that forms pre-verbally in childhood was a polarized template of clinging desperately or complete dissociation. And so those are the two identities, the positions that are available to me for social interaction. And as a cult, we have also stigmatized the strong, close relationship as clingy and needy. And we have shamed men in particular for this, but we've shamed the entire culture for being clingy or needy, as that's unattractive, according to the cult. Now, that leaves dissociation, the extreme loneliness of being dissociated in an insecure attachment, being traumatized and being left in trauma alone, makes that kind of loneliness so painful that there's a shutting down. But we call that, in our cult, introversion. And this is stigmatized as well. So the coping mechanisms that an individual goes through in order to respond to the systemic incompetence of the cult embodied by the parents is constantly shamed and stigmatized. So going more into my head and shutting down more emotionally is the most effective pain management strategy when the conversation about how to improve the parents, or how to improve the school, or how to improve the cult in general, those conversations aren't happening and are not available. But then there's a stigmatization of you're too much in your head. You should be more engaging. You should smile more. Now, of course, smiling more would be very easy if there was something to smile about. But systemic cruelty is not a very pleasant context in which to smile. So it's just another message of there's something wrong with you. And so there's a transfer of the inadequacies of the cult onto those least capable of dealing with them, which is a protocol of failure. If you have a lot of problems in your company and you give all your problems to the employees that are least capable of dealing with them, they have the least experience, the least training, the least budget, they're guaranteed to fail. And if you then shame those individuals as the solution or even fire them, it doesn't fix your company problem. The problem first must be owned by the people who are most competent, and have the most resources. And so, but this isn't occurring in a sociopathic paradigm. Those with the most power want to give the pain of incompetence to those with the least capacity to deal with it. Because that's what sociopaths do. That's what narcissists do. That's what incompetent parents do. That's what incompetent governments do. They tax the poor more and more, while the rich pay less taxes. It doesn't work, right? So in that whole context, I then felt deeply unlovable. A deep sense of pain and fear of being misunderstood and judged, a great difficulty connecting with my empathic, thus the human brain, and a tremendous fear of other people and the general cult that does this to children and then pretends that everything's fine, and says that all that you have to do is make a lot of money and buy a house and do this, and then you'll live happily ever after. Well, I did all of those steps, and after having plenty of money and building a number of houses and learning skills and having a good job and having lots of sex and learning lots of things and traveling, etc., I realized that the cult myth was a lie, that money was not going to heal any of these issues. Now, I also did a number of therapies and diets and things like that. And I realized that $140,000 of therapy was not the issue. Since the age of 14, I have been aware that I'm in more pain than well-being a majority of the time, and that one intelligent response to that is suicide. If you go to someone's house and you realize that you're more miserable at that house than not, and there's somewhere else to go, then leaving the house makes sense. If you're playing a game and you're suffering more in the game than you are enjoying or winning, you don't play that game. I don't believe in playing losing games that lead to tremendous chronic suffering. And life seemed to be one of those games. because everything that I did to improve things led to further shame and further misunderstanding. And nobody ever apologized. We apologize for allowing incompetent parents to raise children. We apologize for not rescuing you. We apologize for not knowing and teaching teachers about trauma. We apologize for shaming you for this. We apologize for shaming you for that. As you figured out what to do here, we then shamed you again for that. We don't know what we're doing, and we apologize. Please help us fix a broken system. That's easy. It's just we don't seem to produce competent adults who take that approach, right? A kid that's in pain can respond to grown-ups who have the maturity and intelligence to at least understand that they don't know what they're doing and that they need some help. But that's not the attitude. It's fit in or be shamed, fit in or be shamed. And then, by the way, we'll do any number of things to make sure you can't fit in. And so, that dynamic, and now I had to, quote, fit in by making money and doing all these, quote, successful things. But I realized that I was in just as much pain as I had ever been. I realized that if 6 hours of therapy with 40 practitioners hadn't cut it, another 6 hours a week of therapy wouldn't cut it either. I realized that if $100,000 in the bank didn't cut it, another $100,000 wouldn't help either. And I realized if top-of-the-line organic food wasn't cutting it, that there wasn't any better food to buy. And so as I took inventory of all the promises, whether from alternatives, do this therapy, buy this crystal, do this, talk with this psychic, do this, or make this money, that all of the promises had failed. And the people who offer the promises do not apologize for the failure, right? It's another source of shame. You didn't do it right. You were supposed to listen to this tape and do this and this and this. Okay, you did that. Well, nothing wrong with my suggestion. You must be defective. That's why it didn't work out. You're supposed to create your own reality and create it better. You did that meditation? Well, there must be something defective with you because the system works. My recommendation works. So if it doesn't work, there's something wrong with you. And so just as the psychologist diagnoses the child, would the parents pay the bill if the psychologist diagnosed the parents? If the psychologist said, there's nothing wrong with this kid, you've been traumatizing him, and you need to take weekly lessons to stop abusing your children, and it'll cost you, X thousands of dollars to get those lessons. There's nothing wrong with your kid. Would the parent in a shame-based system pay the bill, and would they show up and take on the inadequacy of the cult for the benefit of the child, or would they go out and find another psychologist? Narcissists are not very keen to take on more responsibility, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I looked at suicide again, and I considered all of my options, because the thought that kind of kept me on the ground a little bit was the thought, no doubt things are going to look differently after death. And I've had enough transcendent experience to believe that consciousness exists on other dimensions and in other places, and quite likely has a better experience than I'm having here in a traumatized body. And so, it's, for me, the idea of leaving my body and going somewhere else is not necessarily a bad thing. It seems quite likely to be a step up, an improvement. And if I've done all the therapies, read all the books, and tried all of these things, and the response of every therapist and everything, if it's not working, is, well, I'm okay, so there must be something wrong with you, then, I think at some level, it's normal, or if you bring those variables together in the body of someone in a lot of pain, it creates anger, it creates hostility, because no one's carrying the load, no one's owning their ability to respond. In many cases, no one's even gathering the data. The number of therapists that actually do periodic questionnaires to see how well they're doing, or the authors that ask how their books did or didn't work, or the media outlets that say, do this and you'll be happy, they don't have a feedback form. And if the information is volunteered in our cult, it is defended against, is my experience. And so the message from the cult to me was, we'll be crazy. We'll make a bunch of promises and break them. We'll ask you for a lot of money and give you defective information and services. But if it doesn't work, we want you to take on all the shame and inadequacy of the entire culture and pretend that it's all your fault, and then don't tell us about it because we don't want to deal with it. And I think, this is a good recipe for suicide. It's a good recipe for not wanting to play that game. And as it turns out in the American cult, as I make this video in 2022, more people are committing suicide than are dying in car accidents, which for an addicted culture that does nothing but drive at high speeds around in its car for large portions of every day, is quite an accomplishment. But I think this protocol can pull it off because it's so alienating, it's so isolating, it's so unresponsive, it's so lonely that death might well be preferable than this level of chronic cruelty in a cult that then asks for a face that says that everything's fine. How you doing? You're supposed to say, you're supposed to lie and say that I'm fine. Now, if you break that particular taboo and actually tell people I'm feeling chronically miserable, you will find that they do not really want to know. They may get angry at you for actually breaking the facade, because you're supposed to make them feel as if they really care, when in many cases they won't give more than a second for a reply. You're supposed to say you're fine as you're walking away from one another. And I'm not fine. And I've never been fine. This has never felt very good, being in this dynamic. And it's not a dynamic I would wish on my worst enemies. It's not very kind. It's incompetent. It's cruel, and it is effective at driving people into traumatic addiction and either a slow and painful death or a short and potentially less painful death, depending on your method of exiting. So, this being the context in my 30s, when I tried everything that I knew, and so suicide was seeming like a good plan, but I decided to kind of scour around and look at things that I hadn't tried from the angle that, well, I'm going to die anyway in maybe a month. Doing something a little bit risky is warranted. And that's when psychedelics came into mind, and I started learning that veterans of PTSD had been receiving benefit from MDMA and other similar substances, such as psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, ayahuasca. And that's when, the US government's corrupted policy on consciousness control hits one with a ton of bricks, because it is a crime to commit suicide, but it is also a crime to take shamanic plants and explore ways not to commit suicide. And it is a crime to be negative. Everyone will avoid you, unless you're negative about the other group, in which case you can join the complaining group as long as it's not complaining about them. But the trouble is both sides are corrupted in a cult that is traumatically illiterate and asks its children to deal with that. And then punishes the children with severe prison sentences and low-income opportunities, etc., for demonstrating traumatic symptoms. But psychedelics, something I'd never explored, something that I was spiritually biased against, thanks to all the spiritual critics that talked about getting there the natural way, It is interesting as an aside that none of them stop eating food and believe that being spiritual and meditating without eating would be better. So there are certain chemicals that are somehow cheating, but eating broccoli that tastes good and keeps you alive and provides vitamins is fine, but eating mushrooms that give you certain experiences you will also not have if you're dead, that's cheating somehow. So there's an interesting series of filters and slices that don't necessarily make a lot of sense, but I'd bought into that, and so I'd never been high or drunk or taken a psychedelic. And then it turned out that these might be a solution. The only trouble is you can't really read people's reviews online for taking MDMA in your house in America, because the US government will come and arrest you because it's worried about your health if you take MDMA. But apparently it's not worried about your health if you're in a concrete block, eating crappy food, destroying your family and your life. It's only worried about your health if you're consuming MDMA, right? So you have schizophrenia. Now, how many people who go to jail see health improvements? So the schizophrenic government that's doing this for your own good, for your health, right? You can't eat medicinal plants for your health. We're worried about you. Goes and kills off 1% of its population in rapid traumatic terms in jail for our health, you can see the insanity. Now, as a result of not being able to do Google searches and look at reviews of people, there's a very small network of people available who are willing to risk jail time in order to facilitate a psychedelic experience. And the books I read, Acid Test and Food for the Gods, the book seemed to suggest that a sitter, someone who knew what they were doing, not a bad idea, would be with you during these experiences. And the first sitter I chose resulted in a climactic incident in which I had my first blackout of my life. And, here we get into politics again, which is dysfunctional, but it's what we get into. The U.S. government seems to be playing politics, not science, when it puts people in concrete boxes for their own good to protect them from psychedelics. But to counterbalance this false narrative that all psychedelics are the worst thing imaginable and have no redeeming qualities, the other side seems to talk about only the stories where everything works out nicely. And so there were no stories in my books about people blacking out from taking MDMA. But I did. And I hit my neck on a glass jar. And when I woke up and saw where the bump was, I realized that if the glass jar had shattered, I would have cut my throat. And that scared me because I realized I couldn't rely on the books or my sitter either to keep me safe. And when I tried to express the terror that I was feeling, my sitter essentially hung up the phone and said, "We're done here," and left me on my own again. And that's when I turned to Peter Sandhill, a therapist who had shown sexual interest in me when I was doing therapy with him 10 years earlier that didn't end well, because he said he loved me. And because our cult doesn't give a cogent definition of what love is, it generally correlates parental abuse with the word, because parents are supposed to love their children, so the abuse that they dish out is apparently love. And so it makes it hard for the majority of the population to then know what is and isn't love other than the word. And the word is often rarely spoken, and so even the word is somewhat rare, but a cogent definition, what does that mean, is apparently not worth the bother of describing. You will definitely learn calculus and algebra in high school, but love, parenting, how to drive a car, how to run a business, all of the important things are apparently important to keep away from the children that would benefit from them. And that is the high school protocol. Whether you're in Waldorf school or this alternative school, let's keep the most useful daily skills that a child needs to survive in the world away from them and take up all of their time learning stuff that many people will never use again for their entire lives. It's not kind. It's a form of stupidity. But if you raise children not to think, they may not grasp that their teachers are ignorant, or their parents are stupid, and their cult is too sociopathic to do anything about it. You ask any competent person, is learning to drive a car more important than algebra in today's world? It's pretty obvious if you're to look at how many minutes are going to be spent doing what. So why is it some people never learn to drive and others learn in reckless ways because we can't figure out how to make that a part of high school? If we did, kids would actually be interested in attending or making money. How about putting that into high school? You want to make money? Want to team up with mentors? Want to learn how to make something, sell something, trade something, synergize and form a team? Come to high school. How many kids would stay home or fidget around when money was on the line? We're just too dumb to do our kids justice. And by modeling stupidity, we don't give many of them the courage, the facility to analyze the cruelty of our protocols. What's lacking? And I didn't know what love was exactly, but I knew that I wanted someone who loved me rather than someone who hung up the phone on me when I nearly died through an absence of proper medical care for the first blackout of my life. And I didn't want some book hyping something without disclosing the risks. That's not kind. That's cruel. So I chose my next therapist, again, without the benefit of reviews for any of this type of stuff. And he escalated a romantic relationship, my first homosexual relationship, under the influence of MDMA and mushrooms, after insisting on a high dose. And then tried to transfer all of the shame for his incompetence onto me as my last hope. Psychedelic therapy turned into my worst nightmare, resulting in my being evicted from my community because it was important to the leaders that nobody knew that they were charging money to do unlicensed therapy, resulting in sexual abuse. And so now I had no one, and no hope, and was heartbroken, and was confused, and had nothing to live for. I felt more hatred, more pain, more lonely than I had ever felt in my entire life. And no matter where I turned, I could not find competent support for that kind of pain. Because an incompetent cult can produce this level of pain in a percentage of its members, but cannot heal the pain it is so competent at producing. And there I was.